In March 1796, a scrawny 26-year-old general named Napoleon Bonaparte arrived in Nice to take command of the army of Italy, finding not a glorious legion, but a machine in total structural collapse. His 38,000 soldiers were half-starved, shoeless, and mutinous, trapped in the abyss of the maritime Alps, while the superior forces of Austria and Piedmont held the high ground. Napoleon immediately applied the principle of psychological alpha, famously telling his men that while the government owed them everything, he would lead them into the most fertile plains in the world where they would find honor, glory, and riches. This was the five-step process applied to a desperate reality. His goal was the total expulsion of Austria from Italy. His problem was a multi-front war against superior numbers. His diagnosis was that the enemy was divided by political distrust. His design was the strategy of the central position, and his execution was a lightning strike that shattered the external order of Europe. In a mere 15 days, he knocked Piedmont out of the war, forcing a separate peace and turning his full attention to the Austrian machine. What followed was a mechanical revolution in warfare. Napoleon discarded the rigid, slow-moving supply trains of the 18th century, demanding that his army live off the land to achieve a speed that his opponents found physically impossible. At the Bridge of Lodi, he proved his believability by charging into a hail of Austrian grapeshot, earning the nickname the Little Corporal, and realizing for the first time that he was a man of destiny who could reshape the world. He swept into Milan, transforming from a soldier into a shaper of republics, extracting millions in gold to pay his troops and fund the bankrupt Directory in Paris. The campaign then turned into a brutal, systemic struggle around the fortress of Mantua, where the Austrian High Command sent 4 successive relief armies to crush the young upstart. At Castiglione, he taught the world the logic of the maneuver, sacrificing his siege guns to regain the mobility needed to smash Wurmser's pincer movement. In the marshes of Arcole, he survived 3 days of suicidal combat, using deception and raw grit to turn a near defeat into a legendary triumph. Finally, at the Battle of Rivoli, he achieved the ultimate synthesis of his tactics, defeating 6 Austrian columns by moving his interior lines with such precision that he appeared to be in 3 places at once. By the time Mantua fell in February 1797, Napoleon had captured 160,000 prisoners, 500 cannons, and the entire financial alpha of northern Italy. He didn't wait for orders from Paris to settle the war. He marched across the Alps toward Vienna, forcing the Habsburgs to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio on his own terms. This campaign was the prototype for everything that followed. The Napoleonic Code, the Grand Army, and the map of modern Europe were all forged in the dust of the Italian plains. He had proven that radical truth and calculated risk could defeat the oldest monarchies on earth. Napoleon had entered Italy as an obscure artillery officer and left it as the most powerful man in Europe, a systemic evolutionary force that had replaced the disorder of the revolution with the order of his own genius. Focus on the transition from a starving mob to an imperial vanguard, embrace the cold logic of the central position, and remember that the machine of history only moves for those who are fast enough to catch it. This was the secret of the Italian campaign, and the reason the 19th century would be defined by a single name, Bonaparte. While the thunder of cannons at Lodi and Rivoli established Napoleon Bonaparte's military alpha, it was his transition into a political shaper during the lulls in the Italian campaign that truly signaled the birth of a new world order. Napoleon realized that to maintain his interior lines and keep his human machine fed, he could not rely on the bankrupt and chaotic Directory in Paris, so he applied the 5-step process to the governance of northern Italy. His goal was the creation of a stable, pro-French buffer zone. His problem was the deep-seated feudalism and clerical power of the Italian states. His diagnosis was that the Italian middle class was hungry for enlightenment and social order. His design was the founding of the Cisalpine Republic, and his execution was a whirlwind of administrative reform that mirrored his battlefield speed. He didn't just conquer Milan. He occupied it with a mechanical precision, establishing a modern bureaucracy, secularizing church lands, and introducing the prototype of what would later become the Napoleonic Code. This was radical open-mindedness in action, as he balanced the radicalism of the local Jacobins with the traditionalism of the Italian nobility to prevent an internal order collapse. He became a financial alpha by exacting millions in contributions from the defeated dukes and the Pope, famously sending a train of wagons filled with gold and stolen Renaissance masterpieces from Leonardo to Raphael back to the Louvre in Paris. This was a calculated move to increase his believability with the French public, presenting himself as a new Caesar who brought not just victory but culture and wealth. During the long siege of Mantua, Napoleon established a court at the Villa Manin and the Palace of Mombello, where he lived with the elegance and power of a sovereign, ignoring the frantic orders from the Directory and negotiating treaties like the Peace of Tolentino directly with the papacy. He realized that the big cycle of history was moving toward a centralized meritocratic state, and he used Italy as his laboratory. He organized the Lombard Legion, the first modern Italian military unit to fly the tricolor flag, sowing the seeds of Risorgimento and Italian nationalism that would bloom decades later. By the time he forced the Austrian emperor to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, Napoleon had not only redrawn the map of Europe, but had also created a personal brand that was more powerful than the French Republic itself. He traded the ancient Republic of Venice to Austria in a cold-blooded display of realism to secure French borders, proving that his loyalty was to the logic of power rather than revolutionary sentiment. He returned to Paris not as a mere employee of the state, but as the grand architect of a new European system, having proven that a single biological machine of sufficient will could dismantle a millennium of tradition in less than 2 years. The Italian campaign was the turning point where the strategy of the central position moved from the map to the throne. Focus on the administrative genius, embrace the cold-blooded diplomacy, and remember that a conqueror who does not build is merely a pirate. This was the final lesson of Italy and the reason the Napoleonic era was now a global inevitability. With the fall of Mantua in February 1797, the mechanical reality of the Italian theater had shifted entirely in favor of the French Republic, but Napoleon Bonaparte knew that a partial victory was merely a delay of the next abyss. He realized that to achieve a total systemic reset, he had to strike at the heart of the Habsburg Empire itself, so he applied the 5-step process to the invasion of Austria. His goal was to force a definitive peace. His problem was the rugged terrain of the Julian Alps and the arrival of the Archduke Charles, the most capable commander the Austrians had left. His diagnosis was that the Austrian internal order was paralyzed by fear of his momentum. His design was a rapid 3-pronged advance through the mountain passes, and his execution was a display of aggressive persistence that saw his human machine marching through snow and ice to reach within 100 kilometers of Vienna. This was the turning point where the strategy of the central position moved from the Italian plains to the Alpine heights. Napoleon didn't wait for the slow-moving diplomats of the Directory to arrive. He acted as a grand shaper by sending a personal letter to the Archduke Charles, proposing an armistice and framing himself as a man who desired peace while the old kings desired only blood. This was a masterclass in psychological alpha, designed to bypass the official chains of command. In April 1797, at the castle of Eggenberg in Leoben, Napoleon dictated the preliminary terms of peace, essentially redrawing the map of Europe on the back of a drum. He recognized the radical truth that the French Republic needed a secure eastern frontier, and he achieved it by trading away the thousand-year-old Republic of Venice to the Austrians in a display of cold-blooded realism that shocked his own Jacobin supporters. This move eliminated the disorder of an Italian insurrection behind his lines and provided the financial alpha needed to stabilize his new conquests. The final Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797, was the ultimate synthesis of Napoleon's first campaign. It recognized the French Rhine frontier, established the Cisalpine Republic, and officially ended the War of the First Coalition. Napoleon returned to Paris not as a subordinate general, but as a national archetype who had succeeded where the great Louis XIV had failed. He had proven that the logic of the revolution, when guided by a single mechanical genius, could dismantle the big cycle of the Holy Roman Empire. The Italian campaign was the prototype for the Napoleonic Empire, providing the gold, the glory, and the believability that would eventually carry him to the imperial throne. He had entered the Alps as a student of history, and he left them as its primary author. Focus on the finality of the peace. Embrace the cold-blooded trade of Venice, and remember that the master of the machine is the one who knows when to stop the march and start the negotiation. This was the final lesson of 1797, and the reason the map of the world would never be the same.